Okay, so I think before we can really start to understand some of the nuts and bolts of HTML and CSS and all of these things that we're going to learn, I really think it's important that we talk through why the web exists in the first place, and then how web design has really evolved, especially over the last few years. And so we're going to look at a lot of examples today in this module, and we're going to see kind of how things have progressed over time. And so I'm calling this lecture Web Evolution, just for the sake of the fact that we're going to go from very, very early, just text on screen, all the way to new flashy websites. So first, it's healthy to say that HTML is not the same now as what it was even 5 years ago. It's certainly not the same as what it was in the mid-90s. And so web design evolves because, quite frankly, the markup languages change. They either get easier to use or they start to interact in better ways. There are new things that you can introduce over time. So that's a big part of why design changes over time. It's just simply that the language has changed. Also, there's an increased technical capacity. So computers have gotten better. Browsers are now a lot faster. The internet is a lot faster for you to just get personally. You're no longer having to use a dial-up modem or having to go to the library to get fast internet. You can actually just hop on your Wi-Fi at home, and it's really fast and it's really clean. Also, things like iPhones and Android phones, smartphones in general, have really changed the way that we take in mobile information, and particularly web information. So over time, that required a web design change. There's also just simply trends and what's fashionable. What is hot and looks great right now is going to look really cheesy and weird in about 5 to 10 years because we're going to evolve away from that. And then also, over time, more and more research has been done on how users actually engage with the website. And so as we have learned what users are wanting to find, how many clicks are they going to want to do before they get to the next thing, all of that, we have been able to redesign our sites based on that. So there's really 3 eras of web design that I want to talk about today. There's the text-based era, which is what it sounds like. It's just a document with a lot of text on it. The next one is the era of increasing complexity. So websites started to have things like pictures, and they started to link to one another better. They started to be navigation bars that actually made sense. And then the Web 2.0 era. So we are still kind of existing in the Web 2.0 era. And I'm going to explain what I mean by that, the implications for you as a budding web designer, all of that. So there are certainly some new trends emerging today that we're going to kind of hit on towards the end of this overall class. The most important ones being just cell phones. I'm way more likely to grab my iPhone and search for something really quick than I am to pull out my laptop and do a Google search on there. So you need to be able to present information in a cogent, clean way that presents itself on a mobile device really, really well. So let's start with the text-based era. So if you've ever heard the line that Al Gore invented the internet, this is what he was talking about to some extent. For the record, he didn't invent the internet. He just was a part of the funding that started this whole thing. So it was the early to mid-90s. It had some characteristics like it was a lot of text and links, some really, really, really simple graphics and photos. Remember, the internet at this point did not exist like it does now. So a lot of these websites were housed on your personal computer, and someone would use a dial-up modem, and they would just call up basically your computer. And so these pictures could not be very large. They could not be very detailed. These websites might look something like this. This is the original website for CERN, which still exists actually in different formats. But you can see how over time it really has evolved, where this was just a list of stuff. The best thing I can compare it to now would be it's like the index on the back of a book. It's where you went, where all the information was collected to a single place, and then you could click on a site and go and learn more about that specific information. Over time, things evolved. People started using things like tables and different layouts to present information in a little bit neater fashion. The graphics could get a little bit better. If you had AOL in the early days, this was probably the site that you saw whenever you would log on, and it would say you've got mail and all of that. So you can see the difference where this was just simply links, nothing fancy, not even really any thought put into how the information is presented. It's just kind of listed, whereas on this website it's presented very cleanly. There's some thought put into what goes where, and that progressed even amongst websites like Adobe. Adobe is obviously the maker of Photoshop and several other things, and they existed in the mid-90s, and this was their original website. There's not a lot going on. It's really, really plain. The New York Times, they were one of the first newspapers to see the digital rise coming, and they got ahead of the curve, and this was their original attempt. It's kind of funny to look at now, just because if you go look at the New York Times site now, it's so just convoluted, and there's so much information on it. So that leads us to the second era, which was really the era of increased complexity. So sites began to have more and more information. They began to link to more and more other sites. This was really the late 90s, so let's call it maybe 97, 98, all the way up through the mid-2000s. So there's a big emphasis put on decorations of text, animations, and you really wanted people to say, wow, this website is so cool. This was the high time of Flash. It was the high time of where you might move your mouse around and maybe some snowflakes would drop off your mouse or something like that. A lot of the structure was based on tables and grids now. In fact, almost all of it was. And over time, that became just the way that people designed. So these sites might look something like this. This was MTV's website in 98. And you can tell this is old because it says best experienced with Microsoft Internet Explorer, which very few people use anymore. And so everything on here is laid out with tables. It's all in a very simple grid. You want people to be impressed more than you want them to be informed. This was Starbucks' website in 2001. Again, not a lot of information. If I remember correctly, these different parts actually moved as you clicked on them. They had some kind of flash animation. This was Microsoft's website in the late 90s. And it's just really just so plain. And here is CNN's website at about early 2000s. So this was the time of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. They were just starting, and so you can imagine that the country is going online more and more at this point. They're trying to find information about this war that we're starting, and so this is where they would go. And so they needed to be able to find the information really, really quickly. This was Adobe's website, so it didn't evolve a ton from the first iteration that I showed you, but it's different. This is Yahoo's website. This one's my favorite just because to me this is the quintessential increased complexity site. It just has so much information on it that it's almost impossible to begin to decipher it. It's certainly, if you were to pull up this kind of website now on your smartphone or on your iPad, it would be almost impossible to use. So that led us into the Web 2.0 era. So that's really mid-2000s all the way up to now. So really, what are the characteristics of Web 2.0? Well, if we think about it, we have things, that brought us through a number of different changes over time. So in 2007, Apple releases the iPhone, and the iPhone changed the way that you and I both interact with each other, but it's also how we interact with the internet. It changed how we process email. It made text messages that much more ubiquitous. Twitter and Instagram and things like that are made possible because of the development of smartphones. And so the Web 2.0 era has to compete with all of those apps. So if you want to see an example of this is Yahoo in 2004, and just 4 short years later, they've reorganized it to where it looks like this in 2008. And so you can really see the difference. This still is not that great of a site, but if you compare them, they really began to think through, okay, what graphics are going to go where? How are we going to use size and proximity and contrast between colors to be able to differentiate between areas? How are we going to help people find what they want? What's their objective when they come to our site? Are they trying to find news about, in this case, Terrell Pryor? committing to Ohio State? Are they trying to find that, or are they trying to find information about the weather, or do they just want to search the web? All of those things began to take more and more precedence as more and more research was done on web design. So remember, this was Microsoft in 2003, and then 6 years later in 2009, this is Microsoft all of a sudden. So that's a huge change, right? Very text heavy, just a lot of information it still has a lot of text, but it's hidden in logical ways where you don't see all the latest releases unless you click on latest releases. And then, so if we compare them, you can see they really concentrated on keeping that proximity and the contrast between things. Where they want you to go on this site is quite clear. They want you to go watch things about Windows 7, right? They used color to really pop out these different areas. They used graphics that were not going to get in the way, and they really helped people figure out what they're going to look for. So in this case, people come to Microsoft's site. The things they might want to download might be something like DirectRx or DirectX. They might be looking for Internet Explorer 8. They might just want to see what Windows 7 is all about. Well, they can go right here for Windows 7. They can come down here to popular downloads. So that's a perfect way to help people guide through your site. Adobe went through a similar change. Adobe, up until this point, had always had these, really kind of sparse sites that were a white background, and then in 2009 they changed it and they went to this kind of slate gray black gradient site. And so with this, they really are concentrating on just presenting what you actually might want to buy from them. Now, the difference between 2004 Adobe and 2009 Adobe is that in the interim, Adobe bought a lot of companies, and so there's a lot more software packages that you could purchase from them at this point, and they really needed to be able to present that in a cogent way. So you can see the same thing again. They went for proximity. They used a lot of different typefaces this time. The graphics are useful. They very much so guide you to what you're looking for, and it helps people figure out their objective really quickly. Starbucks in 2008 looked like this, and this is kind of incredible to me just because in one short year they went from what was essentially a complexity design to a Web 2.0 design, right? So this became a slider, so there were a few different banners that would come up. All of them were videos. They played something short and very sweet about the coffee and whatever they were doing. And so really, Starbucks came onto it really late compared to some of these other companies, but they came on so quickly that it was quite obvious what was going to happen for them. So some characteristics, well, they focused on simplicity. The designs there was an attempt to declutter them to some extent. If you are a company like Adobe, your site is going to be cluttered to a particular extent. You have a lot of information to present. You are trying to get people to buy a lot of different things. CNN is going to struggle in the same way. So they wanted to declutter the design so that the information could stay cogent. They started using larger type. Larger type allowed them to draw your eye to certain places. So if you look at this slide, your eye is drawn up to the title. It's not drawn necessarily down here to the bottom. And so they started using that to their advantage. They used a lot more white space, and what I mean here is not necessarily the color white, but I just mean blank space. So you didn't need to fill every bit of your website with something. You use that to give you some area. They started to begin to use gradients, which we saw on Adobe's site. There were some fades on several of those sites, some reflections, so it gave this site a little bit of polish. It looked like something that was designed for the web, not something that was written in a Word document and then saved as an HTML. They started using a lot more neutral colors. Overall, the color palettes were a lot more toned down in Web 2.0. There's not a lot of bright flashing yellow and orange or anything in this kind of design era. So what new trends are emerging? Well, let's look at some of these sites that we just looked at, so things like Starbucks and all that, and then let's look at how they've evolved. Well, in 2009, Starbucks went very quickly into the Web 2.0 era, and now they've gone even further. By now they have, instead of having a scrolling list of videos that work as banners, now they have these videos that are embedded into the site, so they don't have to load externally, and you can click on which one you want. you can scroll down on here and find a whole grid of different things. So rather than having an entire block of text about, you know, the Skinny Mocha or whatever, now there's just a picture, a really simple little block of text. It gets the point across. Adobe is very much the same. Adobe ditched the black background after a few years, went back to their regular white, but they didn't ditch the design principles. They stuck with a big banner. So here they have a big banner, right? And here they have a big banner. They kept their navigation bar at the top. What they did do is they got rid of this gigantic products thing, and they just left it up here. They already had a scroll bar up here, and so having it in two places and having solutions in two places kind of seemed redundant, so they just put it all up here. It's a lot cleaner website now. There's a lot more white space in it. You can see these big blocks of area where it just kind of draws your eye where they want you to go. Yahoo, yes, Yahoo is still around apparently, and Yahoo has continued to evolve and develop. Yahoo now looks totally different than it did in the early days, and it looks different than it did in 2008. It's a lot cleaner. It leads your eye to where you really want to go. It's a lot more about presenting you with select stories instead of you letting you select stories out of a big list. Microsoft has changed quite a bit, but still kind of the same idea. They still have a big banner. Just like in there. But here they had this massive, just so complicated entire navigation system, and now it's just 4 really simple things. And now, rather than having, you have to scroll down or anything like that, now it's just very simple. It all stays what we call above the fold. So above the fold in web design means that you're not having to scroll down at all. It's just all presented in one screen without you having to move. And that's what this site really does well now. CNN is always going to grapple with having too much information. They are a site that purposely is meant to present you with information that you could find anywhere, but they want to present it in one singular spot. And so CNN is always going to have a lot of information, but what they've done differently now is that they've attempted to space things out a little bit differently. They give you these trends at the top. So just really quick, if you want to see something about the grocery store shooting that it says here, you could go to CNN, click on the trend, and find it really, really quickly. Overall, they didn't change a lot about their navigation bar between the two. They reordered some things. That's likely due to research. But overall, they just spaced things out a little bit better. Apple's website is really curious to me because in 2008, it was a rather modern-looking site. But then as recently as just a couple years ago, it went to this very sparse, you know exactly what their objective is. They are presenting you with just one thing, and if you want to go somewhere else, you can, but you're going to have to go there. Whereas on this site, they're presenting you with one big thing, the MacBook Pro, but they're going to allow you to go to other things from, just directly from that page. Not really the case anymore. If you were to go to Apple's website right now, I'm sure they would have something about, the most current product, and it would just be presented in this big, bold way. And so that's the new way that they design things. So the web over time has evolved. At each iteration of these, there's been an iteration of the coding languages as well. So HTML has evolved, cascading style sheets has evolved, so CSS has evolved over time. Things like JavaScript, so how things move around, has really come along in the last few years. And some things have died out. So Flash was massively prevalent in the early 2000s, and now no one really uses it anymore. And so this is kind of the way of the beast with web design. It's going to change with every iteration as things become popular and other things fade out. These things are really going to change, and so you have to be aware of that. If you want to see some really interesting older websites, you can go to archive.org and look through a bunch of older websites. It's really kind of fun to look through what Fox News was in the early days, things like that. And then if you want to look through some really interesting design blogs, here's a list of them for you. There's just 5 of them. There's hundreds of thousands of design blogs out there, and I'm sure all of them are really great. But if I ever need a little bit of inspiration, these are kind of where I start. So that's the entire lecture on web evolution. I hope you have enjoyed it, and I will see you on the next lecture.